I start with Christopher Golden and Kim Sherwood, who are here at the Leipzig Book Fair, who make a little talk with the Kriminalakte about their newest books. Kim Sherwood did a James Bond book, and Christopher Golden did a lot of different books, and the latest books in Germany are The Ocean Dark and Road of Bones. Can you tell us a little bit about these two books and what the inspiration was for mainly Road of Bones?
Well, Road of Bones was inspired by a story that I ran across. I stumbled upon a story about the actual real-life Road of Bones, which is in Siberia. And I had never heard the story before. And for those who are unfamiliar, the quick story is that while the gulags were, many of the gulags that were built there were built in order to supply prisoners so that this road, that's 1,200-mile road through Siberia, could be built so that materials could be taken overland. And it's a frozen place where I can't imagine living, but people do live all along the road. And unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people died building the road, and most of them were just left where they fell and plowed under the road. So those people are all still there. And as horrifying as that is, also horrifying to me is the fact that if it's the wintertime and you're in a car and your car breaks down, if somebody doesn't come along in the next 10 minutes, you will die. It is so cold in the wintertime that you cannot survive there without some artificial warmth or being inside a shelter. And so as soon as I came across that, I thought, somebody is going to write a horror novel about the Road of Bones. But I knew that the instinct that 99% of people who like horror stories would have would be to write a story about the people who were buried under the road coming back to life to have their vengeance or something like that. And I didn't want to write that. So I wanted to get there before somebody wrote that version so I could write my version.
And what was about The Ocean Dark? That's an older book of you.
The Ocean Dark is about a FBI agent who's running interdiction in the Caribbean to stop gun runners and drug smugglers. And both the gun smugglers and the FBI agent stumble upon a small island around which are a bunch of sunken ships. And they get to the island because they're trying to find these guns that were stolen. But once they're on the island, they realize that they can't leave because the ships are all sunken, because under the water there's this strange species of aquatic creatures that are basically vampires, but they're underwater vampires. And weirdly, I talked to a bunch of professors and to make it as scientifically possible as possible.
Cool.
Obviously, it's not possible, but that's the goal always, is to say, I know this isn't possible, but how can I make it sound like it is? So.
And these two books are standalone books.
They are. They both are, yes.
And you are writing standalone series, you are writing movie tie-in novels, you write Buffy novels, you write comics, you write things with the Hellboy creator, Minghella. What's the difference for you between these kind of novels and the work with it? I mean, you're also writing a lot with other authors and not just alone.
Yeah. Everything, it's all different. And the different mediums are different disciplines. You have to learn how to do each thing. You can't write comics just if you've written prose. You can't just assume you can write other things. You have to learn just like you learn to do this. And the difference is, the things that are books that I wrote by myself that aren't tied into anything else, or I didn't write with somebody else, are closer to my heart. and they're more personal. But weirdly, people think that the other books aren't as difficult. And in some ways, collaborating with another author or writing an IP book, a book tied into something else, can be more difficult, which we were talking about James Bond.
Yeah, there's another pressure to it.
Right, it's a different kind of thing because you're not only do you have to live up to the expectations of the owners of the IP, but you have to live up to the expectations of the fans.
Absolutely, and everybody has an idea of what it should be like, and you have to try and capture that essence, which is quite intangible in lots of ways. But
in a weird way, you also have to do your
something
story.
New. Yeah.
But also something,
you
know, when you're writing any kind of tie-in work, it has to be something you care about.
Absolutely.
Or I've read some that are, you know, it's not that they're poorly written, it's just that it's clear that the author doesn't care. And I think you need to have an investment in it.
Absolutely. And that was something that when the Fleming family asked me to come on and write James Bond, that was their main criteria. Are you a Bond fan? And I've been a Bond fan all of my life, but when they first were getting in touch with me, they said, is there a way you can demonstrate you're a Bond fan? Because of course everyone can say, I love Bond. But they really wanted to prove
dance,
that passion.
I mean, what is
I sort of came up with a ballet, a Bond ballet. No.
A Bond ballet.
Luckily, my mum had a piece of homework that I'd done in school when I was probably 13 or 14. She hadn't thrown it away. The English teacher asked us to write about an author that we admire, and I had made this booklet on Ian Fleming. It was illustrated, it had pop-up flaps, the whole thing. So I sent a copy of that to the Flemings, and I just said this would quite literally be a dream come true, and they liked my homework, so I got the gig.
A plus.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. It's such a great story, and I'm keen to read it myself. Actually, my one of my connections with my father, who passed away when I was 19, is that he loved James Bond. He fancied himself, you know, the suave, you know, whatever. But he had a collection of the original paperbacks, and I still have those books.
The pan paperbacks.
Well, the U.S.
Oh, okay, of course, different.
So, so I still have his collection of Bond paperbacks from when they, So it's weird because Bond has gone through such a strange evolution over time, but the essence of Bond remains.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it's interesting.
And that's such a special memory to share with your dad, and I think something like that is true for a lot of people, that Bond has a very special place in their family memories or in their childhood,
right.
and so approaching it, you know, it's so exciting, but it's also a little bit nerve-wracking at times because James Bond belongs to everybody, and you know you don't want to mess that up. So I think it's a very precious legacy to be part of.
But you also get into this. It's such a, and I'm going to get in trouble now. But you also get into this this issue where but everybody thinks they know what Bond should be.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So you have to, on the one hand, you have to figure out what are the essential things that you believe Bond should be. But then also you have to say, well, I can't pay attention to, you know, like, honestly, like, I'm really sad that they waited as long as they have, and now Idris Elba is too old to play Bond, because I think he would have been a miraculous Bond.
Amazing.
Like, who's more suave than Idris Elba?
Right.
But I also loved... what's her name? Who was the new 007 in the last?
Lashana Lynch.
Lashana Lynch was great.
She was so
and I would have been like, well, I would love to see. I mean, she doesn't have to be called James Bond. She's 007. Like, I would love to see a spin-off movie with her. So, like, I'm interviewing her now, but it's just like, so what was the what was your springboard?
So when the Flemings asked me to get involved, there were just two criteria. They wanted it to be set in the present day, so bring it up into the 21st century on the page, which is something the films have been able to do because Bond's character has evolved with time in the films, so it's exciting to get to do that in the books. And then they also wanted me to expand the cast of characters, so to bring in these other 00s alongside 007. So in my book we have 003, Johanna Harwood, who's the first... female 00 to be a main character. We have 004, Joseph Dryden, and we have 009, Sid Bashir, alongside Bond. And at the start of the book, James Bond has gone missing, and they are now trying to find him.
In my mind, I'm hearing... how can you not?
I do get to, every radio interview I do, they play me in with the Bond music. And so every interview I start giggling because I just can't help it. I just start giggling, and then the producer says, "And now we're live." So every interview with me is me going, "Ha, hi," just trying to compose myself.
Don't you then want to like turn and?
Yes, absolutely. I've done many photo shoots like that.
And my last question before we actually go back to the real interview is Moneypenny in it?
Moneypenny has now had a very overdue promotion. She is head of the 00 section.
Fantastic. Oh, she could still be M.
She could.
I mean, Moneypenny.
Yeah, she could indeed.
All right, I'll shut up.
No, it's perfect. But can you tell us also a little bit about the inspiration of your James Bond book, what it was? And can you dig in a little bit deeper why they asked you? I mean, you are a new author, you got one book published when they asked you, and the previous Bond book authors were more or less famous or established authors who had a long track record with books like John Gardner or Benson, who was a lifetime James Bond fan.
Right, yeah. Well, I think partly that's it. It's the passion. They knew that I've been a fan all of my life. All of my life I've said to anybody who would listen, one day I want to write James Bond, and it feels pretty surreal and amazing to me that it's actually happened. And for me, the inspiration, when I was little, I used to play Bond, in imaginary games. And for me, my love of Bond and my love of writing kind of grew up together because I loved this idea of spying, and I would spy on all of our neighbours, who luckily were very tolerant about this, and I would write stories about them. So for me, being Bond and being a writer were sort of one and the same in my mind. And then when it came to the actual opportunity, here it is, now I can write my 007. I thought back to, those games when I was a kid, when I would play as Bond. I wouldn't play as a Bond girl, and that's no insult to Bond girls. There's some amazing female characters in the Bond canon, but nobody aspires to be a supporting character, And I used to play that I was the hero, and this seemed to me to be an opportunity, bringing in these new 00s, to invite more people to see themselves as the hero, so you can have characters who come from different backgrounds, bring in different perspectives, while also keeping Bond as Bond, because I love his character and I don't want to change it. So that was a really exciting opportunity for me to try and reflect the world around me, the world I've grown up in, and to create this diverse ensemble cast of heroes.
Well, it allows you to keep the essence of what people want to recognize as James Bond, but also to, as you said, expand that world, so that you don't have to replace Bond.
Exactly.
But you can show that he exists in a world that is our world, which has a lot more to it than just white guys.
Exactly, and to almost see him from other perspectives as well. So at the start of 00 or Nothing, he's missing, and MI6 are trying to find him. They don't know if he's been captured, maybe even killed. And we see him from all these different perspectives. So Moneypenny is his kind of longest friend, and we see a vulnerable side of him from her perspective, thinking back to him. Harwood and he have had a romantic relationship. He's mentored Bashir. Harwood and Bashir are now together, so it's a very awkward workplace love triangle. So you get to see Bond maybe in different ways than we've seen him before, and also get to have the sort of gaze upon him rather than the male gaze upon the female characters. So it was nice to have that opportunity to turn that around.
Yeah, and it's now the most important question is, when you were a kid and you were playing James Bond, did your parents have to tell you that you did not have a license to kill?
My mum was slightly uncomfortable with how many toy guns I wanted. Being brought up by a feminist hippie, she was a bit like, can some of them be water pistols? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
But I remember seeing The World Is Not Enough on the TV as a kid, just walking into the living room and it was just on the TV, and just standing frozen on the living room rug, just staring at this character, thinking, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And I went upstairs and I put on a little suit, and I came downstairs with a magnifying glass and a pen. Like, God knows what my mum thought. But luckily for me, she said, okay, and kind of encouraged everything that came next. And I'm so grateful for that, because I don't think I'd be where I am now if anybody had kind of said to me, oh, that's not for girls, or, anything like that when I was little.
And did it ever occur to you to actually join the intelligence service?
I can't answer that, I'm afraid. a state secret. I don't think they'd have me. I'm actually terrible at keeping secrets.
Okay.
You said you keep the essence of James Bond, but what's the essence of James Bond for you? I mean, from Ian Fleming's Casino Royale to present day, it's a long way, and with Anthony Horowitz books who played in the 50s and 60s, a lot of criticism was, oh well, he's a racist and he isn't nice to women.
As many people weren't in the 50s and 60s.
As many people still are.
Yes, absolutely. Well, for me, the essence of the character, there's a few things, it's almost like James Bond bingo. There's a few things that have to be present. So you've got to have a martini, you've got to have a tux, you've got to have fast cars, and there's a certain attitude to Bond that has to be there. And I went back to Fleming's writing, he talks about Bond being, he has this beautiful description of when Bond falls asleep, and how all of the warmth, once the warmth is extinguished from his eyes, this cruel and cold taciturn mask comes over his face, and he doesn't look human anymore. And Fleming often has those moments where Bond almost becomes a villain. We also see it in The Spy Who Loved Me, when which is written in first person from the main female character's perspective, so it's a really unusual book. When she, there's the Vivian Michel, when she opens the door to Bond in the book, it's the first time she meets him, she thinks he's a gangster, she thinks he's a bad guy, and then he smiles and she thinks, oh, I may be okay. So Bond's character mixes the light and the dark, and I think that's an essential part of his character. So there's the sort of material objects of Bond that have to be there, and the gadgets and the cars and everything. And then there's this attitude to life, this kind of darkness mixed with humour, and he takes comfort in luxury and elegance. Fleming writes about that he takes comfort in these things to survive. So I tried to take that personality and that kind of alchemy and think, how would that be feasible and viable in the 21st century? So my Bond is very different from Fleming's Bond in lots of other ways, because Fleming, sat down to write Casino Royale in 1952, Double or Nothing came out in 2022, very different worlds. But I wanted to think, how can I make that personality feel realistic? And a lot of it went back to his trauma. So his relationships with women, for example, I thought a lot about how he loses his parents at a young age, then he falls in love with Vesper, ends in tragedy, falls in love with Tracy, ends in tragedy. Kind of makes a lot of sense that this isn't a man who has lasting attachments in his life.
I think we go to the next topic, and it's a topic who is for everybody, I think for everybody interesting, namely one who likes to write, namely, and the others who read the books. How do you write, and what's your process with the writing of the novels? I mean, maybe first, Christopher, you got so much books. Is there something, or has it changed over the last 30 years and the last 50 books?
It's the process is different all the time. And it's very different. You asked about collaborating on a book or writing a tie-in book. Those things are very different for me because they require more forethought. And the way I describe the process of writing a book like this, one of my sort of more personal books, is weirdly, I tell people all the time, it's sort of like running into the jungle, because I have an idea of what the book is about. I have a basic plot of the beginning. I don't know how it's going to end, but I sort of know what it's about, and I kind of have an idea who the characters are. And I just start, and I keep writing, and in the process of writing, I get less comfortable with what I'm doing, I get less confident about where I am in the story, and in my mind I envision that as sort of like you run into the jungle, and eventually, your momentum gives out because there are too many vines. At a certain point, I then go back, when I've broken enough path that I can go back to the beginning, and I start at the beginning, and I fix it, and I have new ideas, and I understand a little bit more of what's in my subconscious about what I'm actually writing about, and I get further that time. And I usually do that 4 or 5 times during the process of writing the book. You just go back to page 1 and revise and rethink and just keep sort of breaking the trail.
That's a really lovely way to put it. And then do you find that with IPs or when you're collaborating with other people, there's a strain almost on that process because you have to invite other people into your imagination. So if you say to them, actually right now I'm stuck in a jungle, they're saying, but there's a deadline.
Well, yeah. Well, the weird thing is, I mean, and I shouldn't say this because it's a bad influence on Kim. Deadlines are imaginary.
Really?
Yes.
I'm going to call my publisher right now.
And for the first sort of 10 years of my career, I literally never missed a deadline, not once.
Mm-hmm.
And then the first time I missed a deadline, I never made another one.
I'm making notes as we speak.
So I never made another deadline. But as far as the, I tend to write pretty fast, and but the interesting thing is that when I'm working with somebody else, I will have worked out the plot with that person in advance, or if I'm working on an IP tie-in book, mostly I've worked out the plot, not as much as a collaboration, but in a collaboration I really, except I've collaborated with a lot of friends, but my friend Tim Levin, who was here 5 or 6 years ago, and I have written a number of books together, and with Tim, it's much more like give and take. One of us will write a chapter and then we'll get on Skype or Zoom or whatever and talk about that chapter and what should come next, and that's a more organic process. But generally with working with somebody else, it's we're sort of following the outline, and you don't necessarily have to follow it exactly, but you have to know where you're going much more. How did you work on Bond? Did you have like a really thorough outline?
Well, yeah, what you're saying resonates with me, because for my other novels, I feel like the more you write a novel, the more you get to know it, like getting to know a person, and it tells you what it wants to be. So you might have some ideas to begin with, or it might feel quite sort of ephemeral in some ways, and then you get to know it and it says, actually, this is what I am, or this is where I'm going. But that process can take a long time. So my first novel, Testament, took 7 years to write, and my most recent novel, A Wild and True Relation, from start to finish has been 14 years, obviously with some things in between. But that was a lot of kind of sitting and waiting with the characters and working out, well, what next, and going down wrong paths and then chopping out, redundant 40,000 words. With Bond, there isn't really time for that, and the process can't really accommodate that because it's much more collaborative. It's, the Fleming family still shepherd the books, and there's publishers all over the world involved in the process. So I've tried to learn a different way to write for these books. I mapped out the trilogy, and the first scene I wrote actually was the last scene of book 3. So I know where I'm aiming.
Wow.
But how I get there is taking some diversion. So I gave them this outline, and it's sort of, you hand it over, but slightly tongue-in-cheek, thinking, we'll see how true this turns out to be. Because you get to know the characters differently. So Double or Nothing actually ends very differently than how I imagined the first book would end. And then the second book is taking a slightly different shape, and probably the third will as well, because I'm getting to know the characters more. So for me, it's a little bit like sculpting. I think about it like gathering my clay. I'm gathering and I'm gathering and I'm gathering. And then it's often in the editing process that I work out what shape it actually wants to be, and I start to strip things away and say, that's what this piece wants to be. But with Bond, I'm just trying to learn to do that quicker than 14 years.
So you said sculpting. A lot of times I've also likened it to archaeology in a way.
Yeah.
You're sort of uncovering this thing that's already there, and you just have to sort of find it, you know, and then clean it up and do it. Yeah. I also tend to find almost every book of mine that I write, I get about 2/3 of the way through the book, and then I'll be out for a walk, or I'll be in the shower, and I'll have a moment of epiphany where I realize what I've been writing about all along.
Yes, absolutely.
And as soon as I do that, I go, okay, with that, now I understand what I have to change, how it changes.
Yeah.
And once you have that moment, you know your ending is going to be great. But then you know you have to go back and sort of
and draw things to the
modulate
surface.
everything.
Yes.
So that it feeds into the thing you realize this has really been the topic from the beginning.
Totally. And there's always that maddening moment where somebody says, oh, I thought you knew you were doing that. I thought that was conscious.
Right.
Well, no, and it would have been helpful if you told me.
Yes.
but I think it takes time to rise up.
Yeah, and you probably, if somebody had suggested that to you at the time, you wouldn't have been receptive to that
Absolutely.
suggestion.
No, that's not what I'm doing at all.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. I also find with the approach to point of view for me often shifts about 2/3 of the way into the book. So my first book, after about 70,000 words, I realised half of it was in the wrong point of view. Went back and rewrote half of it. And with what I'm working on at the moment, I realised that something quite fundamental about the point of view had to change. And oftentimes it will be that I've written it in the point of view it should be in my notebook, and then typing it up, I've changed the point of view for no good reason, really. Oftentimes just because I think that's how it should be.
Okay.
And then about 2/3 in, I think, but why did I think it should be
Why
that
did
way?
I think it should be that way?
Why have I constrained the book and kind of moved away from what organically happened? And then I have to go back and find that and bring it back in. So the first time it happened, it was frustrating, but now I've kind of learned to almost wait at sort of 2/3 point. Think, and at some point soon I'll realise I've gone in the wrong direction, and I'll have to course correct.
Yeah, and you do and when you do course correct. Also, I felt the same way with working with editors over the course of my career. Early on, I would get, that sort of stroppy kind of like, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And then eventually you come around to being like, okay, you're probably right. But now I'm much more embracing, when the editor has a suggestion, I'll think about it. I may not fix things the way the editor suggests.
Sure.
But I always think, why is the editor saying this? What is the reason
What have they
behind
identified?
it?
Yeah.
But back to the topics, like with Road of Bones, we talked about the sort of inspiration for why I came up with the idea, why I wanted to write the book. But I found as I got deeper into it that what I was really writing about was sort of the idea of the places where humanity has not reached, where we haven't ruined everything, where we haven't touched things, and that there is a sort of primeval, there are still places in the world where there's a primeval nature. And I don't, not that I believe that there are spirits there or anything like that, but I feel like if there were, that's where they would be. They'd be at the bottom of the ocean, and they'd be at the edge of, because if you think about it, yes, there are people who live here, but there are those people live on the fringes of human endurance.
Absolutely.
And beyond that, there is a world beyond that. And you think about what is there,
and that idea of history rising up. I was reading the other day about the permafrost melting in Siberia and revealing woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and all of these ancient skulls
and all
rising
kinds of
up
germs
again.
and bacteria that we haven't been exposed to in hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. That's a concern.
Very much.
And that's another thing that I do think is interesting. I haven't written about it, but the other thing that I find really interesting about that whole area is that there are parts of the world that were covered in ice that are no longer covered in ice, and that will continue to happen, and that now nations are fighting over that.
Right. Yeah, and future trade routes.
Right, exactly. We always have something to fight about.
Yes, true.
But anyway.
Okay, with the time, it's time for my last question. It's always the same with authors who are, I suppose, I hope, happy readers. Which books would you and you recommend for the next holiday? Which 5 books, except your own books, and in this case, except of Christopher's or Kim's books? That would be heavily cheating. So 5 recommendations for the next summer holiday.
Maybe we should take turns that way and give each other time to think about.
Okay. Well, this is if people are going on a really long holiday. But the Wolf Hall trilogy by Dame Hilary Mantel, you may need to go away for about a year. But what a nice holiday to go on. It's about Thomas Cromwell and Tudor England, and I think they are some of the most beautiful words ever written.
The problem is that I read so many books now that I forget
what you've read.
I forget what I've read. But I think I lean heavily on my favorites, my all-time favorites. One of my all-time favorites is A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. And I feel like there's a stepping back in time element to that. that I really appreciate.
Mm.
So
Yeah, good
thanks.
choice. Well, you should definitely take some James Bond on holiday with you, always. I would recommend, if you've never read Fleming, I would recommend going to the beginning and reading Casino Royale, start at the start. But my favourite Fleming is From Russia with Love, where we see Bond from the perspective of the enemy. And we see Fleming testing this myth of Britain that he's created through Bond's character. So that's my favourite one.
Good stuff. Let's see now. I read a ton of mysteries as well, crime novels, really. And so I'm going to say Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. I've, fallen in love with so many just amazing crime writers, but I feel like he is the most recent one. There's so many crime writers I like have been writing for a long time, but Sean is a really gifted writer, and he's kicking butt. So.
That's exciting. So, sticking with crime then, Elmore Leonard is one of my favourite crime writers, and I mean, you could just take any Elmore Leonard and you'd be happy, but I would suggest taking Be Cool, which I think is one of his most metafictional books. I feel like crime often gets separated off from the rest of literature, but Elmore Leonard, for me, is just an amazing writer of any genre, and ought to be talked about in the postmodern school. Be Cool is an exceptionally postmodern book, and really fun, so I would recommend that one.
And I'm struggling to remember the name of the book. I love Tana French. Have you read much?
Not much,
There's
to my shame.
It takes place at a school. I'm trying to remember the name of it.
That does ring a bell.
I'll think of it later and let you know. But I found her because I watched the television series The Dublin Murders.
Yeah.
And so I started reading her books based on that, and that I think is adapting 2 different books. But she's great.
Yeah, really cool writer. Sticking then with women writers in the genre. Well, so women writers in spy fiction don't get talked about much, but if anybody's curious, I would really recommend The Heat of the Day by Elizabeth Bowen, which was published in 1948, I think, and it's based on her experiences in wartime London. Oftentimes when we give the history of spy fiction, we give quite a gendered history, quite a male history, but there have been a lot of amazing female writers in the spy genre, and she was there right at the beginning, alongside Fleming, and then going into Graham Greene and John le Carré and all of those amazing writers.
Yeah. That's really early. That sounds
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, it's really worth reading. Incredibly, very luminous prose, and it's set during the war, so it's very claustrophobic, but it's about how life kind of carries on in wartime London, but in this quite giddy, almost sort of suicidal way, where people just daily think that they're going to come to an end, so everybody's just kind of almost living these alternate lives, lives they never would have lived before.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that. There's I'm going off track, but there's a book that I love that I read on vacation, actually, by Chris Cleave, called Everyone Brave is Forgiven.
That's a good title.
Great title. And it is set, he's a male author, but the main character is female, and it's set during the Blitz, and she's a school teacher and stays in London during the, but anyway, it's very tragic and beautiful, and loved it. And now I've completely lost my train of thought. The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. And it's, for people who are not familiar with it, it's the story of the World's Fair at the same time, in Chicago at the same time that H.H. Holmes was becoming, supposedly, the first serial killer in America. It's a terrific book.
Yeah.
I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but he writes extraordinary nonfiction stories, and he always does this thing where he combines a sort of evolutionary cultural thing with something horrible that really happened at the same time.
Right.
And this story is about how the existence of the World's Fair drew tons of young women to work in Chicago from the outskirts of the town at a time when it was still unusual for women to not be chaperoned.
Right.
And it made, of course, people vulnerable because and this guy happened to be taking advantage of that. So on the one hand, it's the story of the creation of the World's Fair and how the architect got the green light and how the Chicago City Council manipulated the system so that they could have the World's Fair. And it's also the story of this killer. But he's written a bunch of other sort of books that follow a similar pattern. Really good stuff.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Is this my last pick?
Yes.
Oh, it's a lot of pressure on a last pick.
I know, I'm just saying.
Sticking with amazing female characters, Modesty Blaise, the Modesty Blaise series by Peter O'Donnell. Peter O'Donnell is one of my favourite writers, the only author I've ever written fan mail to. Wrote to him when I was a teenager. He was very nice and wrote back. So he began writing in the 60s, and Modesty Blaise exists as a comic strip and a series of novels. She's a criminal turned spy, and for my money, she's one of the coolest heroines in fiction and in popular culture.
Good stuff.
Technically, you have 5, but number 6 is okay. Your
Oh,
last one.
do you have
No,
another
no,
I
if
thought I
you.
had another one, no?
Yeah, no, sure. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I thought I had done 4 only.
No. We are cheating.
We're cheating. Oh, boy.
You're going to have a mischievous one.
A mischievous one. Oh, boy. Again, this is a tough one. Let's see. I mean, all right, you know what? Because it was an independently published horror novel by Violet Castro, who's actually a Mexican author who lives in the UK, and it's called Queen of the Cicadas, and it was her sort of breakout, and I think that she's really on the verge of becoming, she just did actually an alien novel about Vasquez, the character Vasquez from
cool.
Alien.
Very cool.
Yeah, great. And she's super talented. I'm reading her short story collection right now, which is called Mestiza Blood. But Queen of the Cicadas is sort of like, it's the same kind of story as Clive Barker's Candyman, about that sort of urban folklore element, but from very much the perspective of a Mexican woman. Great book.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you
Thank you.
for your
Thank
time, for your books, and the tips for the next very long weekend.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.